Good evening and welcome to TDM Talk Show. I'm your host, Joana Freitas, and with us this evening we have Michael Shelden, a fiction critic for the Baltimore Sun and a features writer for the Daily Telegraph. Michael Shelden is also a teacher for the Indiana State University, but is most known by his career as a biographer. He was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 1992 for one of his most recognized biographies titled Orwell. Thank you so much for being on the show with us. Good evening. I'd like to start by asking you about the option of writing biographies. Why choosing to write about real stories, about others?
You know, I've often discovered that real stories, they strike you at some point as you couldn't make them up. They take twists and turns that I don't think even sometimes a good novelist could think of. So I like the unpredictable path that biography takes you. You never really can predict very well where a true story is going to lead. And I like that sense of discovery that you get with a good biography. Though you usually know it's going to end in death if the person is in the past very far. So you know how it's going to actually end, but you don't know how you're going to get there, how you will arrive.
Mm-hmm. That discovery is what grabs your attention to start. But is there a heavier responsibility of writing about people that you don't know, about people that have their own lives?
Yes, you want to get at the truth, obviously, but today so many people are quick to dispute that the truth is even possible. I think it is, but it always has to be grounded in some kind of documentation or a reliable narrative from people who were there at the time. They either left behind a memoir or you were able to interview them. But getting the truth down, trying to really establish what happened to a person in their life, that I think is a real challenge. And I've tried to do it well, but you never know.
Mm-hmm. Do you often feel that is a bigger challenge when you start writing? It's a challenge in the beginning, but when you start writing it and you see the twists and ways that you mentioned before, have you ever thought about giving up on writing about someone because it's so challenging?
That's a good question. No, I haven't felt like giving up. It almost propels you forward to discover what the truth might be. So you feel almost a compulsion to keep going. And fortunately, I haven't run into any major obstacles that would stop me. But you sometimes worry that you won't come up with the material that you need to fill out, say, 300 or 400 or 500 pages of a biography. So it's a risky business.
There's also somehow a personal side of this type of writing. If I recall correctly, on George Orwell's biography, you start referring to him by his birth name, Eric Blair, and in the case of another biography that you also wrote, there was some controversy about Graham Greene. When you write these biographies, do you often encounter differences between the person that people know, the public persona, and the person itself that you chose to write about?
Yes, absolutely, because what I've discovered not only as a biographer but as a journalist is that people are very good at hiding their secrets. They're very good at pretending to be one thing when they're another thing. And I've found that very interesting to get behind the facade that people put up to try to pretend that they're something. They may tell you they're one thing, but actually they're another. So to cut through that and get at the real person, that's a challenge in life as well as in biography.
Do you often do this in your real life?
Yes.
When you're not immersed in books?
Yes, I'm very skeptical. I look at people and I wonder what it is they're hiding, because I know most people are hiding something. And it's usually, Orwell said, that you would hide something because you were afraid of embarrassment. You wouldn't want to be embarrassed admitting a truth about yourself. But most of us, I think, if we actually revealed our secrets, would realize a lot of people have the same secrets and our embarrassment would fade away. Mm-hmm. But we worry about it, so we hide it.
Mm-hmm. You were mentioning that embarrassment, and I saw some of the reviews about books, about some of the biographies that you wrote, and you get a lot of mixed reviews on your work. Some people love it, some people have a lot to say, some people even bring the fact that you're American and you're writing about British people. So there's a lot of mixed reviews. Do you think about the perception that people are going to have when they read your book? You mentioned that you only want to write about real facts and truth, so I'm guessing that's not a problem that you see when you start writing a biography.
No, it's amazing to get the kind of reviews that you get when you write a biography, because just as the biography itself is very personal, the reviews are personal. So people will not stick to the facts, they'll question my motives, why I would try to discover something that was previously private or hidden. And they resent it, I think, in some cases, as people would resent if I went prying into your life. You'd say, why are you trying to find out things about me? So it comes with the job, I think, to be a bit concerned about why you're trying to dig up this information. And you might say, because I think the story is worth telling, but telling correctly, telling as close to the truth as you can get. Mm-hmm. But people debate the truth with you. They say you may think you have the truth, but you don't.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you follow up on those reviews, on that criticism, or you've written so many books? Did you just get to a point where you ignore, like if we can use this word, that you ignore these reviews because you know what's the meaning and why you're doing this?
Yes, what you discover if you've been doing this a long time is that if it's true today, it'll be true tomorrow, the next day, forever, right? So if you try to get things correct and true, then in the original moment where they come out, there's a lot of discussion. And I've tried to ignore that and wait for time to prove that I got the truth. So that's actually, I think, happened with all the books. Initially, people overreact, and then over time they come to accept what you said, because if you got it right, if it was true 10 years, 15 years ago, it'll still be true today. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that you were also a journalist. Well, when you write biographies is one thing, but you also got to interview, and you're writing biographies about people you never met, or most of them you didn't meet. Do you ever feel that it's kind of abusive, an intermission, what you're doing? Do you feel that these people wouldn't give you the authorization if you got to ask them, and the authorization that you received through other people that were related to the people you're writing about?
I don't think anyone wants someone else digging deeply into their lives who's going to do it objectively. Because again, why did you hide things about yourself in your life if you weren't afraid that people would discover the truth? So sometimes I don't find the truth is so shocking, but if it happened to be hidden, it was probably hidden for a reason. And what I discovered in my interviews I did as a journalist, these weren't interviews that were short. They were very long. I would go to the people's homes or their businesses and sit down and talk to them for hours. It's funny, in about 300 or 400 interviews with fairly famous people, I was never corrected. I was never, afterwards, no one ever said, you misquoted me or you got this wrong. So I would think that might occur to some of the people who criticize my biographies, that if the living people say I got them correctly in terms of their quotes, maybe I got the dead people right.
That's exactly one of the things I was going to talk about with you. You interviewed, I remember, actors, for example, living people, like you say, and you just answered my question, really. I was actually going to ask you about the difference between living people can tell you exactly what they feel, how they were interviewed by you, and then you don't have that from the people you're writing biographies about. So do you do anything different?
Oh, I feel that I learned a lot from journalism, because that one-on-one interchange, the sort of thing we're doing now, is invigorating, because it gives you a sense not just of what people say, but the kind of person they are, the way they say things, if they're sincere or if you feel you can believe them. I think the biggest problem writing about dead people is you lose that sense of how they actually said the words, whether they smiled often or they laughed openly. You miss a lot of those details that we get in real life. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's good for the biographer, because they're missing a crucial element of what it means to be human.
Mm-hmm. When you do this, you have access to personal papers, personal items. After you do this, how does it take time to absorb it all?
Yes, but it's fun because you might find something today and 2 weeks later find the missing part, or a month later, or a year later. So it's like putting together an intricate jigsaw puzzle. Mm-hmm. You know, you suddenly realize the pieces over here belong right here, so you move them over. So it's collecting all of this information, and I think the real joy for me is seeing where the pieces fit.
Mm-hmm. Do you take a long time to do that, to
No.
write your book?
No, I believe very much in going fast, because the faster you go, the more you're liable to see or to remember where the pieces go. Mm-hmm. You remember, oh, I saw that only last week in a letter or something of that kind. So you immerse yourself into it, I think.
Mm-hmm. After you write a biography, or on the process of writing a biography, do you feel that you understand the person that you're writing about more, like what they did, what they do, why they wrote about what they did, especially in the cases like of Orwell with his dystopian worlds, and Melville with his fantasy of going after a whale? Do you feel that you understand them better?
I think so. In fact, one of the best compliments I ever received is when I wrote a book about Mark Twain, who smoked 20 cigars a day. So whenever you were around him, you were around somebody smoking cigars a lot. And a reader said to me after reading my book on Mark Twain, they said at the end of the book they felt they could flick the ashes of the cigar from their own sleeves. They felt they had gotten that close to him. So that's what I like to do, establish that sense of intimacy. But you can think of how disconcerting that is, because you're getting very close to someone, mm-hmm. and sometimes that doesn't always feel right to be that close. I'm staring as closely as I can into a life, and no wonder some people get upset, relatives, other people, afterward, because they think, what right do you have to get that close? Mm-hmm. You weren't even a friend. But I don't see any purpose in doing it if you're not going to try for that sense of intimacy.
Mm-hmm. And how do you deal with that intimacy? Because the same way that you're mentioning that sometimes you're too close, you don't feel, do you have to sometimes to get a barrier and say, okay, I'm writing this, I cannot have feelings or for this person's life, feel pity, or because someone failed, it wasn't a successful author until he was dead. How do you distance yourself from that?
I don't actually believe in distance. I don't think it's you want to tell the truth and in that sense be objective, but I believe it's very important to sympathize and to become as close as you can to the person, because that makes you understand what they went through and why it was important that certain things happened. You want to feel an identification with your subject, because that brings, I think, a greater understanding.
Mm-hmm. And when writing, are you able to separate that?
I don't really, as I say, I don't really try to separate the two. I feel, for instance, when Orwell's first wife died, she died of a botched hysterectomy on an operating table at the end of World War II. And she was writing a letter just before the operation to Orwell. Mm-hmm. And I found that letter, and it ends because the drugs they gave her to put her under started to take effect, and so it just ends with her trailing off in words. And I held that letter in my hand, and that was a very moving experience to get that personal, where you're reading literally the last words someone wrote, mm-hmm. before they don't know it, but they're going to die in this operation. And to hold that in my hand was very moving. I didn't want to be detached at that moment.
Mm-hmm. And that also, that not wanting to be detached helps you to show people that are reading your books that this is a version of the truth?
Yes, and it always seems to come around to letters. with older people, the letters sometimes give you that sense of intimacy. And people say to me today, well, we don't write letters anymore. And I say, if I had access to your email and your text messages, I'd have the same thing, maybe even more. It would be more revealing. So don't let me get near your email or your text message.
Still write letters. Could you write a biography based on someone's emails?
Yes. Oh, they'd be wonderful.
And text messages.
Yes. People are so unaware of what their words look like when they're sending them out as texts that it's fun to look back at them and put them all together in the same way and see how unconscious they are of what they're really saying. You want to say, did you really mean that? You just said that? I always say to my students, I say, don't send a text message or an email unless you want to see it on a building 20 feet high in a huge video message, because it's not private. It can be seen, and you should be careful what you say, but most people aren't.
You were in Macau for the literary festival, Script Road. This was your first time in Macau?
Yes.
It was also the first time talking to, I assume, an audience that it was so diverse?
Oh, yes, wonderful. I loved it. And I loved talking about trying to understand Herman Melville's story, because he was in love with the Pacific Ocean. He never got as far as Macau, but he actually was fascinated by Camoys and the whole story of being on Macau and writing his masterpiece here. So he had a great feeling for the Portuguese language and for the Portuguese national poet. So it was a real honor for me to come here and go to see the grotto and all that sort of thing, the gardens. I liked that a lot.
It was exactly, the Melvin in Love was the book you came to Macau to talk more about. For those who don't know, this is the story about the Herman Melville's relationship with Sarah Morwood.
A married lady.
When he was writing Moby Dick.
Yes. Just at the time he was starting Moby Dick, he fell in love with a married lady. He was married. He had only been married 3 years. She had only been married about 4. They discovered they were the people they should have been married to, but they had married somebody else. And it happens all the time. And that love affair in the 1850s in America was so fraught with danger because of this potential of scandal that they developed a real obsession about keeping their relationship private and secret. And that sense that they were involved in a dangerous obsession, I think, drove a lot of what Melville wrote in Moby Dick about an obsession to find this white whale and destroy him at the risk of everything. So I saw a connection between the two things, the famous book Moby Dick and the personal life of the writer Herman Melville.
That's an interesting point of view. What made you decide to go after this story? When did you find out about this?
From letters. Again, the letters are so crucial. He wrote 6 beautiful, long letters to Sarah Morwood that survived. Only 1 letter to his own wife has survived because he tried to destroy as many letters as possible. He had secrets to hide, so he burned many letters. He didn't get to these 6 letters, and they reveal just how strongly his romantic attachment to her, to Sarah Morwood, was. And that was the start of my discovery of that affair.
So, but your process of writing a biography, do you go after certain authors or certain people that you want to write about, but what makes you go specifically after that, the story of that person?
You suspect, or I suspect, I have a gut feeling that there's a great story there. You just, sometimes it's like a good journalist. A good journalist will think, I think maybe there's a story there, and pursue it. Same way in biography. It's always the suspicion that you're on the trail of a good story. And so far, when I start that trail, I finish it. It may well be one day I won't, but so far that's been the case.
There's one of the an interesting recurrent situation that we can find in your books, I think. It's usually you go after details that not many people have been paying attention to. I have Mark Twain's, the white suit he put on was almost your inspiration, if we can say, for you to talk about him and Melville's secret affair, like you were just mentioning. Why do you pick these little details?
Because it's in those little details that people give themselves away. It's often the truth is in plain sight. The information you want is right in front of you, but they don't pay close enough attention to the revealing details. They overlook things like, why only in the last 3 years of his life would Mark Twain suddenly start wearing this white suit from head to toe? And it became his trademark look. What was the reason behind that? No one had ever asked. So I ask questions based on things I think obvious, should be obvious to people. I say, isn't there a reason they did that? And most people say, well, I don't know what the reason is. But there's a reason for almost everything we do. I don't think anybody does anything by accident. I think they do things very deliberately and thoughtfully. It's just that most of us don't question.
Are those choices, do you think, conscious?
Mostly, I think they are. I think you don't get up every day and dress in white without asking yourself, why am I doing this?
You also mentioned in one of the interviews you gave to other media, video interviews, you talk about liking stories that also have something epic and dramatic.
Yeah.
Do you think that's what pulls people to read?
Oh yeah, I think most of us underestimate how big, how important a life can be. When you study the life, for example, of Winston Churchill, he lived nearly 90 years on this earth and he did extraordinary things. I like that sense of a big life where you see many things, you know many people, you make a huge contribution, people debate it, they argue about it. That's a big life, and I like big lives. I like that sense that when we end up here on earth, we do big things, we don't do small things. I think a lot of people live way too small. They live at a very low level of life, and they should see that everyone has the potential to live a big life. I don't see why we're here if we don't do that.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned about enjoying big lives, but in some of the biographies you wrote, you focus on certain years, a certain amount of time. Is there a reason for that? Is that because from all that big life, that was the most dramatic or interesting?
That's a good point. Yes, that is the case. You pull something out of a life where the life lived in a few years reveals the true person. Sometimes you get lost in all the detail of a long life. So if you focus on a certain revealing, dramatic part of that life, a lot of the whole life comes out in that small section. It would be like if you had a friend and you got to know them very well over a 2 or 3 year period. That would establish for you who that person was. Mm-hmm. And years later, you would recall them according to what you knew in that small period. Most of us don't have lifelong friendships. Most of us know people really intimately for only a few years. Then we move on, we get other friends, we do other things. Mm-hmm. But that small slice can be enough to tell you all you need to know.
Did you find differences when you were writing about these people on certain ages? Did you find that, like you were saying, I know these people, I know this person because I wrote about 5 years of her life where this person behaved in a certain way. But then if you go before those years or after those years, have you ever encountered differences between the same person being different?
I think we're remarkably the same from about the age of 10 or 11 on. I don't think we change that much. I think things happen to us that sometimes make us a little bit different, but the basic character of a person is probably formed pretty early, and what changes are the things that happen to us. But the kind of character, for example, who gives up easily and walks away, or the person who stands up and fights, a lot of those things are shaped very early on, and it's just an interesting thing to see how the pressure of outside events affects that inner character.
Mm-hmm. In the case of George Orwell, and I mention this because you have 2 books written about him, he was always very pessimistic about the success of his books. And do you discover why was that?
I think it's easier sometimes to be successful if you expect failure. In other words, success sometimes, I think, depends on taking risks where you think, if I risk this, I'll fail, but it doesn't matter. I think success largely comes because you're not afraid of failure. You're willing to do something that will fail and accept it. So I don't think a lot of people take enough risks in life to find their success because they're so afraid of failure. Orwell wasn't afraid of failure, and therefore he succeeded in a spectacular fashion. I mean, he's now probably considered the greatest British author of the 20th century. He didn't expect that.
And he didn't get to see it.
He didn't get to see it.
You, as an author also, do you think about this also, about the success of being a well-known writer, or about the failure?
Yes, I think I risked failure several times myself, and I'm glad of it. I think it's important to be completely open to failure, because failure, for one thing, teaches you a lot. You learn a lot from failing. If you have a lot of easy successes, that's why so many young pop stars or celebrities don't do well in their 20s and 30s. If a lot of success comes to them early and easy, they don't know how to handle it. They need a good failure to teach them how to handle success.
You also mentioned before that usually there's no authors that are completely satisfied with their books, with their art, with their masterpiece. Do you feel that with your own books?
Oh, sure. You would never be satisfied with anything you did. You always finally just say, that's the best I can do. I want to move on. And I think it's important to move on. I think I actually love stopping at a certain point and saying, that's it, that's the best I can do. Now it's time to go to something new. Because a lot of people, this is very true in biography, will spend 20 years trying to write what they think is the perfect book and end up with nothing. So you can sometimes have perfection be the enemy of the good. You'll never get the good out because you want so much to have the perfection. And I think you have to accept it's always flawed. It's never the perfect book you wanted, but it's better to get it out there.
And the fresh archive that you are always looking for, that you mentioned that is so important to write a biography. Do we have more fresh archive coming out? Do we have more biographies coming out?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they're all over the place. They keep turning up all the time. People, papers emerge from old attics and closets, and things show up all the time. So yes, I'm always on the alert for that. And I love the idea of walking into a fresh set of papers. That happened with Churchill, and I was overjoyed at the Bodleian Library in Oxford to find a lot of papers by a woman who loved him, Violet Asquith, and that revealed a whole new story. And that was something that had not been discovered. So they're there. Those papers are there.
So you've mentioned in another interview before and we were talking about the little details that you notice that people sometimes don't. And one that got my attention was really the speech of Franklin Roosevelt. You mentioned that he says the only thing to fear is fear itself, but you mentioned that after that famous quote, he says that fear will leave you paralyzed. And that caught your attention because he was indeed paralyzed. It was a physical thing, not a metaphor. Can we expect a Franklin Roosevelt biography by you?
I would love to write about that period where he wakes up almost literally one day and finds he's paralyzed in middle age and has to reinvent himself, and spends about 10 years trying to restart his life as a man who's in a wheelchair. I like to say about World War II that the super race, the Germans who thought of themselves under Hitler as a super race, were defeated by a man in a wheelchair and an old fat man, meaning Roosevelt and Churchill. So it's incredible to see how much will and strength comes out of both the old Winston Churchill and the paralyzed Franklin Roosevelt.
Pulitzer finalists and the winner of National Indiana Author Award prizes. What does this mean for an author?
It's nice because it means that your work is recognized in a way that often comes with money, and it often comes with a big ceremony or event. So suddenly what you do in private, because writing is a very private act, you have to experience it as now a public event where people have you speak at dinners or hand you awards. And I think most writers like that. There are some very popular best-selling authors who never get an award, and they hate that. I've spoken to a lot of best-selling writers, and they hate the fact that even though they sold millions of books, nobody ever gave them an award.
It's like not being recognized.
Exactly. And I think that's significant.
If you had to leave a message for people that are wanting to go down this path of writing, to be authors, and you probably have that since you're a teacher also, what would you say?
Go into film. I think that's the future. I think writing documentaries, creative films, any of that kind, because the whole world seems now to be streaming content. That's what they're doing. And it's exciting with the drone cameras that we have now and the beautiful digital cameras we have, to shoot real stories and to follow somebody on these detective journeys of discovering the truth about the past. We can do it in a new way now. The writing is still important, but the writing now is something you do in order to tell a story on film or in video. And I'm excited by that. I still like doing books, and I still want to read books and discover new things in books, but I'm also excited about the possibilities for video.
The format that comes out then is different, but the principle is the same.
Yes, and I think it makes a difference if you can write. In other words, a lot of people who make films can't really write. They're not very good at that. So it's good if you can write a good narration for a film, have it stand up by itself, and still integrate well with the film. I think that's very important and a rare talent. So I'm excited. I could see another 20 years of doing this, but largely in video, using the same techniques you use to do a book, but now to make say a documentary.
Thank you so much for being with us on the show. It was really, really pleasant to have you here, and we hope to see more movies or books coming from you. Thank you so much. That's all the time we got for tonight. We'll be back next week with more TDM Talk Show.